News of a brutal murder is always shocking.
The cordon has gone up around the building. Police said their search was still going on.
He was maybe surprised at the amount of blood that produced.
We know that he was very manipulative and charming.
But when the crime is committed by a cop, it seems even more horrific.
Locals knew the couple had not been getting on, but no one expected anything as vicious as this.
Nobody wants to believe that police officers are criminals.
To die at the hands of the very people sworn to protect us is, for me, the ultimate betrayal of trust.
This man has brought shame on the Met.
He's got a very warped moral compass and probably has some sort of power trip, a lust for power.
In his mind, he probably thought, well, I'm a police officer, so I will get away with it.
In this series, I'm going to unravel the outlandish plots, lies and deceit of officers who attempt to get away with murder. To his neighbours in Wilmslow, an affluent town in Cheshire, Police Inspector Darren Mackay and his wife Leanne had the perfect life. Married for 13 years, the couple drove brand new cars, went on luxury holidays, and lived in an expensive house. But beneath the facade, their perfect life was built on a foundation of loans and increasing debt. Until eventually, the pressure became too much for Darren Mackay. He couldn't face Leanne's worries about their finances any longer, and he snapped, murdering her in their own home. Then, in an effort to evade justice, he tried to cover up his despicable crime and carry on as if nothing had happened. In a society increasingly driven by image and status, I want to know how the pressures of keeping up with the Joneses can drive someone to murder. I've brought together a crack team of experts who will help me unravel what happened in this case and how Mackay's training enabled him to cover up his crime. Former top anti-corruption cop Julie Mackay, Serena Simmons, a leading psychologist, and ex-Met murder detective Howard Groves, who helped solve over 50 murders. They are going to help me understand some of the worst cases of killer cops in Britain and around the world. I'm meeting with former Detective Superintendent Julie Mackay, who's discovered some more background on this disgraced cop and his wife.
Darren and Leanne were married. He was an inspector in the police, and she too was a police officer, and she worked as a detective. They'd moved from one house in Manchester to another one that was much bigger and wanted to have a really nice lifestyle.
But the couple's efforts to keep up appearances had started to put a strain on their marriage.
Their credit cards were maxed to the hilt, they had a great big mortgage on their house, they liked expensive holidays that they couldn't afford, and nice cars. They were living beyond their means.
So this really is a point where I can imagine if I was in his shoes, he must, he's sinking.
Looks like it.
Just after 1 p.m. on Thursday the 28th of September 2017, Darren Mackay arranged for a surveyor to value the couple's house in connection with a loan application. And so he left work at Stretford Police Station midway through his shift and headed home. But Mackay wasn't just meeting the surveyor that Thursday. He also had other plans. Because before the surveyor arrived at the family home, Darren Mackay would murder his wife. And this is a man who hasn't had previous convictions, any allegations of violence. There's been no red flags about Darren Mackay at all.
Nothing like that for him at all.
Sounds like he's just snapped. But was this a heat of the moment crime of passion, or was there something more sinister involved? I'm meeting up with local journalist Mike McCarthy near the couple's home in Cheshire. I'm hoping he can tell me a bit more about this case. I want to know more about what Leanne and Darren were really like as cops and as a couple. What was Darren like as a copper? What was he like amongst his colleagues and friends?
He was respected. He was certainly well regarded. He'd risen to the position of inspector. I think the best phrase to describe him was a safe pair of hands.
What do we know about Leanne? Because she was in the force as well, wasn't she?
Leanne was in the force as well. She was described in court as a lovely, generous, caring person. And certainly that was supported by the neighbours. She was someone who they really liked, who was trusted and was welcomed into the community in which she'd moved.
Where do you think the crack started to happen here with Darren Mackay and his relationship with Leanne?
When you look back at the history of this couple and their relationship, the skeletons started to stack up in the cupboard right from the word go. It was assessed. Every month they were spending £1,500 above what they could afford. Darren Mackay could be very manipulative, and he told her over and over again that it was all being sorted out. That was in control now. But it was always something that worried her. I mean, at one point in the marriage, the couple's families had to bail them out to the tune of £91,000.
Wow, really serious. There must have been a point for Leanne where things had got to a head.
Absolutely. In the month before her death, she discovered that Darren had tried to take out a £10,000 loan. Now, she questioned him about this, of course, and true to form, he denied everything and said, well, this must have been a fraudulent application. So that's, you know, how things had gotten.
Darren Mackay's mindset at this point, he knows he's spiralling here and he's getting deeper and deeper and deeper in debt. But he's burying his head in the sands. He's not facing his problems. And Leanne didn't realise that things were about to get much worse. When the post arrived on the morning of the 28th of September 2017, it sparked a chain of events that would end in tragedy.
Leanne received the package on the day of her death. She opened the package, she signed for it, it was recorded delivery, she opened it. Inside was her passport, which she didn't know had been sent away. There was one of her pay slips that Darren Mackay had managed to get her username and her password, and using police computers in police time, that's a crime in itself, managed to fraudulently download one of her pay slips and sign it. He forged his own wife's signature, and that, for Leanne, was the final straw.
Darren had abused his position as a police officer. He'd lied to his wife and had fraudulently applied for a £54,000 loan, which would plunge them even further into debt. It was too much for Leanne to take, and she sent Darren a text while he was at work.
This text was to prove absolutely pivotal in what Darren Mackay did next. That is the text that she sent.
It says, "You liar. Just got back a loan application with my passport and my name. WTF."
Tragically, that text was, she basically signed her own death warrant with it, because Darren Mackay, this cool, calm, collected man, must have been incredibly angry, boiling with anger at that point. He left the station, he was on his way home to confront Leanne for the last time.
So this text really is the point. This was the start of the end of her life. Darren Mackay was described as a rising star who had locked up countless criminals in a successful 21-year career at Greater Manchester Police. Away from work, however, he was being crushed under a mountain of debt to keep up a lifestyle he couldn't afford. By September 2017, he had reached breaking point. Psychologist Serena Simmons has studied this case and is going to give me an insight into Mackay's state of mind. So I just want to talk to you about Darren Mackay. What do you know about him?
He was a very respectable police officer. He'd climbed the ranks, was doing incredibly well. Pillar of his community, people looked up to him. So he was married to a beautiful wife, friends and family just really put them on a bit of a pedestal from what I hear.
When you see a case like this, and it's a policeman, obviously, you look for reasons why they would do something like this. And what did we see when you looked at Darren Mackay?
He seems like the kind of person who needed everything to be in its place. Everything was controlled, and he was in the driver's seat. They had to look a certain way. They had to have a particular house in a particular area. They wanted very specific cars. They were keeping a facade of a family, essentially, who were doing well, but actually behind the scenes living well beyond their means. We do know that.
Do you think Darren kept how much debt and secrets from his wife?
I think his wife knew they were in debt. It would have been really hard for her to function in that relationship with the kind of house they had, the cars they had, the holidays they wanted to go on. She would have known about the debt that they were in as a couple, but I do believe he kept a large portion of that very secret from her. His wife found out that he was applying for loans without her knowledge. But at the same time, I do think that he was trying to keep that sense of control across the board.
On the salary he was on, he couldn't afford to live the life he was living. Why would he want that pressure to do that?
That's a really good question. I think so many people do get into debt for really, really unfortunate reasons. So something could happen to you or me one day and suddenly we find ourselves in a very different set of circumstances. The difference here is that this particular couple seemed to have deliberately, over an extended period of time, continuously lived beyond their means.
In your opinion, would you think that leading up to the day that he committed this horrible crime, that was it like just a ticking time bomb of, if you don't face up to the reality, it will come all crashing down on you one day?
Yeah, I really get a sense that he was holding it all together, and I think he felt that if he could control it, if he had the control over it, that it would all be okay. He wasn't the kind of character that dealt well with challenge. So I think his wife challenging what she did on that particular day and being angry that he'd held this secret from her, that tipped him over the edge.
I'm starting to understand this guy's state of mind. But to get to the heart of this case, I need to examine what happened in the hours leading up to the murder. I now know what pressures and worries drove Darren to kill Leanne. But I want to find out more about the horrifying actions that led to her death. I've asked former Chief Inspector Howard Groves, who has over 30 years' experience solving high-profile cases and murder investigations, to help me understand the events of that day. Why do we think Darren did this?
He'd obviously received a text from his wife. She had by then received the post, and in there were 2 passports. She'd obviously worked out that he had fraudulently trying to get some money in order to meet the needs of the family. So she sent him a text and said, WTF, what's happening? So he said to his colleague, look, I'm leaving, I'm going home now. But that didn't really ring any bells because he had already indicated that he was going home early that day to see a surveyor.
Darren left work earlier than planned and headed home. Later, during the investigation, police were able to track his and Leanne's movements that morning on CCTV.
He would have driven home, but that meant that his car would have been on CCTV footage all the way, so the police were able to track from when he left the police station to when he arrived at home in his vehicle. And that was critical, because prior to that, his wife would have had taken the children to school and she would have driven her Mini back again. So that you would have some continuity saying the car is seen leaving her Mini in the morning, her car comes back, and it hasn't left, so she's at home.
This placed them both in the couple's home at around the same time that Leanne was murdered. How exactly was Leanne murdered?
The pathology was able to say that she had pressure to the throat, which created 2 broken bones in her neck. In addition to that, she also had a cut on the inside of her lip.
So maybe he was trying to stop her from screaming, or?
I think if you put your hand over someone's mouth and you use your fingers to hold their nose, you're trying to stop them from breathing, or you're trying to stop them from shouting. And let's face it, he would have had neighbours either side of him. So if she was screaming in fear of her life, then that would be the natural reaction for him to do.
With Leanne dead, Mackay began to plan his next steps. With his knowledge of police methods, could he cover up the murder of his own wife? Ex-Detective Superintendent Julie Mackay is talking me through the Rogue Coppers' movements following Leanne's death.
Darren knows that the surveyor is coming at 1:30. We know that at 12:45 p.m. he is seen reversing her Mini off the driveway. So within an hour and a half, he's killed her, put her in the boot of the car and parked that round the corner out of the way. The surveyor is early and is parked up in the street just after 1 o'clock, and he sees Darren walking back to the house. The surveyor waits a few minutes and then he goes and knocks on the door, and he describes Darren as being really cool. There was nothing to indicate that he had just committed a crime, and has a perfectly normal conversation with him for the next 40 minutes.
I wonder if Darren could potentially use a surveyor as an alibi to say, well, I couldn't have done anything. I was with this alibi. I've got this alibi. I was with the surveyor in my house and he saw there was nothing untoward.
Exactly.
Another thing makes me think, I wonder if that's why he put the body in the car and drove it out of the house, because he knew someone was coming to the house and potentially would have to look around the house because it's a surveyor, and would have maybe found the body.
Yes, I think you're quite right about that. He would definitely have had to move the body out of the house, knowing that somebody was coming. And moving the car around the corner just gets it out of eyes view, doesn't it?
Was there anything else that he did to try and cover his tracks to give himself another alibi?
Yeah, so he then starts to send some text messages to her, just checking, is she all right, where is she? He's now thinking, the police will look at my phone. He works in intelligence, remember, he'll know about all this stuff. And so he's starting to set up his story and support his alibi going forward, this early on in the day.
The series of texts ended with a final message to his wife.
He then goes to the school in the afternoon, where he picks up his children and speaks to other parents at the school gates.
Chatting away is again giving him another alibi to go, well, he was in a lovely mood, he couldn't have done anything.
Exactly.
How can you be so calm and collected? You've just murdered your wife.
He certainly appeared to be really detached and very calm, having done such a terrible thing. I think that having killed his wife, he's then gone into almost like a policing mode, where police are really good in a crisis and can be very, very calm. He's definitely used his job to think about what he's going to do to cover his tracks and get him out of trouble.
So his job really has given him an advantage on, I know how I can try and get away with this. Darren Mackay's calmness and ability to go about the rest of his day acting normally has really shocked me. I want to talk to psychologist Serena Simmons again to see if she can explain how Mackay could appear so relaxed. I suppose what I can't really get my head around with this is, even though murdering his wife is horrendous, it's how he reacted afterwards. It wasn't as if it was an accident, if you know what I mean. He reacted like very calm, and it was calculated, wasn't he?
What's interesting is he slips into a particular mode of functioning as soon as he's done it. Arguably, there'd be some people who would call the police.
Exactly, that's
but
my
he didn't
point.
do it. Then, again, that controlling nature came into play. I'm not going to lose my family, I'm not going to lose my house. I can sort the money out, get rid of this, get rid of the evidence. And obviously with his knowledge of how police investigations work, again, tapping into that emotional intelligence, I know how I should behave in this particular situation, he was able to switch that on and off.
So in your opinion, Darren Mackay had an ability to just switch his brain into another mode to go, this has happened, deal with it. And that's what he does. And not only does he deal with it, he tries to cover his tracks.
He kind of went into overdrive, which is very much a self-defense, kind of fight or flight response. He decided to fight, but it kind of went into this hyper drive of behaviour. This is about ego and self-preservation. He wasn't able to even contemplate losing what he had. And for someone like him, why should he? I get what I want.
Now that Mackay had killed Leanne and set up his alibi, he needed to figure out what he would do with his wife's body. An alibi alone wouldn't be enough. He needed to distance himself even further from Leanne's death, and to do that, he needed to ensure her body would remain undiscovered for as long as possible.
He just wanted to get her remains as far away from the home where the attack took place to give the impression that she was probably attacked by a stranger.
Darren Mackay and his wife Leanne seemed to have it all. A happy marriage and an affluent lifestyle. In reality, however, their perfect life was a sham, covering up a mountain of debt and spending that was spiralling out of control. On the morning of her death, Leanne discovered that her police inspector husband had forged a loan application in her name. It was the final straw. After she confronted him, Darren Mackay snapped and killed Leanne by strangling her to death. Mackay's behaviour doesn't make any sense to me. Aside from their money worries, Leanne and Darren seemed to have a happy relationship, and I can't figure out how he's been driven so suddenly to murder. Clinical psychologist Roberta Bapp, who specialises in forensic psychology, is going to help me get some insight into what could have pushed Darren to commit such a horrendous crime.
In most instances when a partner is murdered, there is some prior history of domestic violence. What's interesting about the case of Darren Mackay was there's no reports of previous domestic violence, and so the incident when he murdered his wife felt very uncharacteristic of their relationship and very much out of the blue. It may lead us to think about whether Darren Mackay meant to kill his wife in that moment, or whether he was acting out something that he couldn't verbally articulate.
Roberta thinks that rather than premeditated murder, Mackay's explosion of violence could have been him snapping under the pressures of the couple's financial problems.
The stress and distress of being in debt can have a huge impact on someone's mental health. And all of these emotions come together in a really unhelpful way. The stress is going to leak out in other places, becomes an overwhelming and all-encompassing experience. Money is intrinsically tied to our survival, and that can be threatened in cases of debt.
But although Mackay was in a cold fury, the manner he chose to express his violence is also revealing.
Strangulation is a very intense and intentional way to end someone's life. When a person is strangled, the person who's strangling has a real sense of power and control. That person's life is in their hands. So strangulation is such a powerful method of ending someone's life. It has real psychological connotations because it tells you a lot about the offender's state of mind and their relationship to the victim at that time.
With years in the force, Mackay knew that police would begin to connect the dots, and he would become the prime suspect in Leanne's murder. He knew he had to dispose of the police's biggest potential clue, his wife's body. Local journalist Mike McCarthy is meeting me not far from the couple's home to talk me through Mackay's movements in the hours following the murder and after Darren had calmly shown the surveyor around their house, with Leanne already dead. So after Darren Mackay had committed the murder, what did he do next? He didn't show any signs of anything was wrong?
I think that from the moment he realised that Leanne was dead, everything just about that he did from that point on was from the point of view of a police officer. He'd killed his wife, then carried on pretty much as normal. To all intents and purposes, this was the everyday Darren Mackay that everybody knew. He then went out in Leanne's car.
At 10:30 p.m, Darren left the family home, collected Leanne's red Mini and headed to Paddock Hill Farm, not far from the couple's home in Wilmslow. Police believe that when he arrived, he realised the water wasn't deep enough for him to leave Leanne's body there.
He'd seen a sign in the past, it's believed, that suggested that there was deep water in a pond. When he got there was no water.
With his plan starting to fall apart, Mackay had to come up with an alternative. He left Leanne's phone at Paddock Hill Farm to throw detectives off the scent, before heading back towards another possible site to dump his wife's body, the nearby lake.
He no doubt thought as a police inspector that he'd committed the perfect crime and covered up his tracks as well as anybody could have done.
But just hours later, as he headed home from dumping Leanne's body, cracks started to appear in Darren's master plan. At 1:30 in the morning, he was seen by a police patrol on a road near his home, and they stopped to talk to him.
Nothing too suspicious as far as the police were concerned, kind of thing that they're dealing with every day of the week.
He's walking home, what's the problem, sort of thing. He told officers he was fine and almost home. Mackay refused to give police his name or any other information about himself. As he was not breaking the law, they let him go.
He must have thought that when the police sent him on his way, that was it. Yeah. You know, job achieved. Yeah.
But it wouldn't be that simple later on. In the early hours of the morning, around 2 a.m, police spotted Darren again, still out walking, but this time with a significant difference.
An hour later, they came across him again. This time it was different. They noticed that he wasn't wearing any shoes.
Of course, I mean, the fact is they've stopped him once and he didn't give him his name. Second time now, he's not got shoes on. So this is obviously raising suspicion, like what's going on with this guy? There's something wrong here.
Alarm bells going off, far more to this story. Yeah. So the police insisted on taking him home. They, at that stage, must have thought there's something more that we need to investigate.
I want to hear from Detective Howard Groves to find out how police officers would have acted after they saw Mackay out that night acting strangely on his walk home. You think from the moment the officers would have seen not only him walking, but the next time they see him walking with no shoes on, there'd have been a suspicion there, wouldn't there? Of this is strange behaviour.
I think from the moment those officers who picked him up on the first occasion and then said, okay, let him carry on in his merry way. On the second occasion, when they see him and he's not wearing the shoes, they obviously asked him questions, and he gave, to all intents and purposes, a reasonably plausible excuse. You know, I'm not wearing my shoes because they're a bit too tight. I've had a bit to drink. I can't drink and drive, which the officers would have gone, yeah, that's true, but I'm trying to find my wife, so I'm just walking to see if I can find her. Even though he would have given that as an excuse, they would have still been thinking, it doesn't all quite sound quite true. And it's only because they realized that he was wearing the police-issued trousers that gave it away. So he didn't have any other option at that point to say, yes, I'm a police officer.
Mackay was forced to explain that he was out looking for his wife who was missing and hadn't been responding to his texts.
That's when they would have thought, okay, he's probably had a bit to drink. We don't know what's happening domestically. We'll get him home.
Officers decided to take Darren home.
And he shows no emotion whatsoever. And the officers are thinking, oh, what's happening? Well, he was cold as ice, and he wasn't showing any empathy.
So they might have looked to him like, oh, everything's fine, but they're probably thinking, when we get outside...
Yes, let's see.
When police officers came to visit Darren Mackay, he was described as being cold and detached, and this could be for different reasons. One reason could be the fact that he didn't feel he had to put in a performance anymore because the act of killing his wife had been completed. Another reason may have been the fact that he was preoccupied with the practicalities of now trying to ensure that he got away with the crime.
But that's not the only reason Darren may have seemed detached. He was well known by his work colleagues for being able to hide his emotions.
Darren Mackay's nickname within the police force was Mr. Spock, and this could communicate a number of things. He may have been seen as someone who's devoid of emotions or someone who lacked empathy, both of which are concerning if you're thinking about a member of the police force.
Police now believe Leanne, a fellow officer, to be missing. Unbeknown to them, Leanne had now been dead for around 14 hours. Would Mackay, famed for his inability to show emotion, be able to play the role of a concerned husband convincingly enough to deceive his colleagues? Darren Mackay, a rising star in Greater Manchester Police, murdered his wife Leanne when the pressure of the pair's mounting debts became too much for him to bear. From the moment of her death, sometime between 12 and 1 p.m. on Thursday the 28th of September 2017, Mackay used his knowledge of policing to cover up his wife's murder. But despite his best efforts, he had been spotted by police acting suspiciously in the early hours of the following morning as he was making his way home from dumping Leanne's body. The priority for the cops was now to locate the missing woman. Their first task was to try and find her mobile phone. The police returned to Mackay's home around 4 a.m. to ask for his help.
The police, they've gone to him and said, we need to know where her phone is. So he can't get away with not looking because they're standing there over him. Yeah. That comes up as being at a place called Paddock Hill Lane, which they take the screenshots of the location and they send it through to the control room.
Is that where he's thrown the phone into water?
They send the police to go out there and have a look for the exact location, and they discover the phone, and next to it is a sign that says, beware deep water, but it hasn't actually gone in any water at all. So now the police have recovered her phone, and it's not damaged, and they can get that back and get the data off it.
The phone would be a major lead in solving the case. But where was Leanne? That question would be answered just a few hours later. At 3:45 a.m. on Friday the 29th of September, around 15 hours after her death, Leanne's body was discovered in Poynton Lake by a member of the public who was walking home. I'm visiting the park with local journalist Mike McCarthy to find out more about that night. Now that Leanne's body had been discovered, a theory was emerging about what had happened to her and who was responsible.
He went out in Leanne's car, bringing the body here. He parked that car 140 metres away from where we are at the moment, and it's thought that Darren Mackay dragged the body the full length of that 140 metres, dumping Leanne right here on the edge of the lake.
It's mad being here. Just because I spent so much time here as a kid, fishing there, just over there I was fishing and innocent, and there's been a body dumped just here. An innocent woman been killed. Very strange being in and around the environment, because it's a beautiful place and it's got great memories for me, but obviously not for Leanne's family. We've just walked that just to get to this position, and it's a walk, you know, but imagine not only you dragging a body, but not only a body, that's your wife.
Who knows what was going through his mind at that point, given the other things that he did, given his behaviour the rest of that day, to have been so careless, if you like, as to dump the body in that kind of way. But he knew that later he would say that she must have been killed by somebody else.
Right.
And that in a way it was a bit of a decoy, certainly from someone who knew how the law worked, knew how policing worked, knew what kind of clues the police would be looking for.
Despite his police knowledge and his attempts to stage a fake crime scene, once Leanne's body was found and identified, Mackay was immediately arrested. When police arrived at his house, they had noticed his washing machine still running in the middle of the night, as Mackay desperately tried to rid his clothes of trace evidence. Forensic investigator Jim Fraser says this is quite common in cases such as this.
As a police officer, Darren would be aware that many homicide investigations are solved quite quickly by immediately finding what can be quite obvious evidence. It's not uncommon for people who have been involved in crime that involves blood being shed to try and wash it out of their clothing. Placing clothing with body fluids on it in a washing machine doesn't necessarily completely destroy the evidence. So stopping the machine as quickly as possible would minimise the possibility that evidence was going to be lost.
With vital forensic evidence recovered from the family home, and Mackay himself now in custody, the police weren't looking for any other suspects. It was just 17 hours since Leanne had been murdered. So after he's been arrested, they obviously have to interview him. What did he say?
When a suspect's interviewed for murder like this, they tend to do it in stages. So the first interview is always, tell us what you know. And then he has an opportunity to say the truth at that stage, if that's what he wants to say. And inevitably in this case he doesn't. He says, I don't know anything. So he starts off with his interview by denying all knowledge of her death and how it's happened. So then they disclose a bit more of the evidence to him about what they know, and he continues to say, I don't know anything, it's not me, I don't know how she died, I'm not responsible.
But Darren did eventually change his story.
He actually says, yes, Leanne drove her Mini and I was with her and we went somewhere, but she didn't want to get involved in the whole financial thing that I'm sorting out. So I then let her carry on and I then walked back home. So yes, it gives some credence to what he was trying to create, was an alibi that we're driven away, because obviously he may have thought maybe there may be CCTV showing the car driving away.
Darren claimed he never saw Leanne again after she drove off. And so with him maintaining his innocence, it was down to the officers to put together the missing pieces of this case. And a major breakthrough would come when the data on Leanne's phone was recovered. Police could see on the day of the murder, Leanne and Darren's phones had been travelling together. Most damningly, they found that the phones had been together at 2:40 p.m. that day, after Darren had already messaged Leanne asking where she was. Not only that, but the phones were together at the very location, Paddock Hill Farm, where Leanne's phone was later discovered. So, he's travelling with her and her phone is in the car, so you can see that. So he's messages saying, where are you? I don't know where you are, but at the same time, the phones are close by together.
Exactly. They're together, and not only are they together or near the house, they're then together at this other location, and you can see that the way they go, the way they travel together, and then they come back.
So the mistake he made was he should have destroyed the phone. He really is a bad criminal. I mean, he's banged to rights now. What would he be trying to say, what has happened to her? What was he trying to make it look like?
And he could use the fact that they've got these money worries, couldn't he, to say that she was upset. And then he would try and suggest that somebody else had killed her. It had been a stranger attack.
So while she was out walking, she's gone for a walk around the lake at night, as you do, and been attacked by a stranger and been killed. That's what he was trying to get away with. But Mackay's story that his wife had driven off in a fury only to be murdered later by a stranger didn't add up. And, crucially, he was unable to explain why his and his wife's phone were in close proximity when he was texting to ask where she was. Despite Mackay's best efforts to commit the perfect murder, his plan was falling apart piece by piece.
If she wasn't found for a few days or even weeks, the forensic evidence then would diminish, wouldn't it? Yeah. And he probably would have been in quite a good place, to be honest.
When police found his missing shoes from that night dumped in a nearby bin, Mackay must have known the game was up.
When the police recovered the trainers, it would have been obvious to them that there was blood and body fluids on them. The first thing they would want to do is establish whose blood that was. The process of doing that is they would be sent to a forensic science lab.
When the results of the tests came back, they pointed to only one conclusion.
The trainers were almost overwhelmingly damning. Firstly, they have body fluids on them that match his dead wife. Secondly, there is DNA inside them that establishes that he was wearing them and that by inference that he owned them. And thirdly, there is this very odd set of circumstances where he was seen by two police officers wearing the trainers, later seen by the same two police officers not wearing trainers, and gave them an explanation that simply wasn't credible about why he wasn't wearing them.
Forensic officers could now confidently tie Darren Mackay to Leanne's death.
It's quite clear that his experience as a police officer was a significant factor in this case. If he'd managed to put the body somewhere where it couldn't be found, or could not be found for many weeks, it would do two things. He wouldn't come under immediate suspicion, And the longer the body is missing, particularly if it's in water, the more chance that they wouldn't be able to identify the cause of death. It makes it difficult to build a case against somebody. But of course he encountered 2 police officers in the process of this on 2 occasions, and they were plainly suspicious about his explanations.
Mackay's trial started at Chester Crown Court on the 5th of March 2018. He initially pled not guilty, sticking to the claim that a stranger must have murdered Leanne. But just 9 days into the hearing, with the evidence stacking up against him, he realised he had no choice but to change his story.
Once he realised the evidence given by the prosecution was building up and it was all working against him, he then tried to say, look, I want to plead to a lesser offence. The judge quite rightly says, no, can do, it ain't happening. And once he was then convicted, the jury made the decision.
The jury found Darren Mackay guilty of the murder of his wife Leanne by a majority of 11-1.
The judge then said, okay, you were a police officer, you had sufficient knowledge and experience of being an officer, so no, I'm going to make sure, instead of you getting 15 years, which is what I was going to give you, I'm going to give you some more on top of that, because you did everything to evade being caught. So you're going to get another 4 years on top, so you got 19 years.
With Darren Mackay receiving 19 years in prison, there would be at least some justice for Leanne's friends and family. This tragic pair had tried so hard to keep up appearances and had lost everything due to a police officer who turned out to be a cold-blooded killer.
This was all about self-preservation. Many people don't think they're capable of doing something that they end up doing, but that fight or flight really kicked in.
I think if this case had happened anywhere else, it would have been shocking. But to be where he lived, to live the life that his family lived, to be respected police officers, to have no idea whatsoever, you know, not even an inkling that he'd got any bad marks in his record, it hit the community hard.
Members of the police must have been feeling let down, betrayed, horrified and surprised, and angry that a colleague could act in such a brutally violent way.
I think this would have been really difficult to work on. Nobody likes the idea of a police officer killing anyone, do they? It's despicable. We're there to protect people. And then the fact that his wife is a serving officer as well. Can you imagine how hard that would have been? 2 people that you probably knew, one has killed the other, and you have to work out what's happened and almost detach yourself from that emotional sadness. You'd think he was despicable. Killing one of your own colleagues that you've worked with, and his wife.